Hey guys, thanks so much for checking out my channel. I really appreciate it. Please click to subscribe. I'm outside the prison here outside San Diego where Lyle Menendez's parole hearing was held. He was also denied parole, just like his brother Erik was the day before. So they both will not be getting out on parole. But it was interesting. We learned new things both days. They went into great detail about the murders, about their disciplinary history in prison. And we weren't able to report any of this while the hearing was ongoing, but we were getting notes about what was happening inside. So in this video, I just want to go through everything that we learned for people who have been following the case. I'm not going to leave much out. I'll try to read slower today. Some people said yesterday I was going too fast. So I'm getting into all of it in this episode of Brian Entin Investigates. All right, hey guys, I'm back in the car. Again, my hoodie's up because I'm blocking the sun. It's super hot. I'm going to do this similar to the way I did for Erik Menendez's hearing, where I'm going to just read through everything that happened during the hearing, since this is the only way you guys will really know all the details, since there were no cameras. And I'll try to read slower today. This is for obviously Lyle Menendez. It started with Lyle saying he was a little anxious, and the attorney saying she objects to the media presence. This is Lyle's attorney saying, I draw the panel's attention to the family's unanimous and strenuous objection to media presence. It undermines their dignity, she said. It's a violation of Marsy's law. They desire the freedom to make statements that express their feelings, share their most intimate thoughts without being concerned about media headlines. And then Garland says she understands Rummel's concerns but overrules the objection. And saying this is a public proceeding and due to transparency, the decision was made that the media will be allowed. So Rummel notes the board did not ask a lot of questions about the trauma Erik suffered during Thursday's hearing, but reiterates for Garland that he wants to speak openly and honestly about what drove this crime. Garland is obviously the parole commissioner that's there today. Rummel also objects to the comprehensive risk assessment from CDCR. Rummel raises questions about whether or not the board has record of a confidential report involving any incident or incidences where white power gangs asked for Lyle to be removed from a yard for not fighting back against Black and or Latino gang members. Garland says she will work to confirm the file has been looked at, but notes she does not have questions about it. This appears to have happened in the late 90s. Garland says Lyle's documents were clearly heartfelt, well-written, informative. Lyle says all of the documents have been written over the past 5 months in anticipation of a parole or clemency hearing. Garland asks how the sexual abuse impacted Lyle's decision-making in life. It was confusing, caused a lot of shame in me. That pretty much characterized my relationship with my father, he said. Lyle says around the age of 7 or 8, there was a lot of waiting and not knowing when something would happen that night or in the bathroom or in the car with relation to his father on any given day. He said it left him in a state of hypervigilance. Lyle says he felt a total disconnection from everybody in my life growing up, somewhat born from a fear that people would see the sexual abuse in him. He said Jose never spoke with him about the abuse after it stopped. I was getting pretty strong lessons about not trusting the world around me, Lyle said. Lyle says he was abused from age 6 to age 8. Lyle thinks it stopped because his cousin Diane told his mother. I think it's related to his being concerned that I would talk to people. Lyle wanted to sleep in Diane's room. She asked why, and I was specific about my father touching me, Lyle said. Lyle doesn't know if Kitty informed Jose, but he thinks she did. I was the special son in my family. My brother was the castaway, Lyle said. Lyle says he got more attention, more focus, more emphasis on performance. My father just attending my practices, spending the time with me in the basement, imparting his lessons. It was just obvious if my brother and I were both on the court, he was with me directing my motions. The physical abuse was focused on me because I was more important to him, I felt. Lyle says his father expected greatness. He spent a lot of time talking about the lineage of the family, lions versus sheep. Everyone else is sheep, and we come from a lion bloodline. We were different. I wasn't weak like his father or Erik and my mother. It was him and I in this bubble, Lyle says. Garland asks about after the abuse stopped. It took me a while to realize that it stopped. I think I was still worried about it for a long time. I was just a little amazed. In my family, it was just like it didn't happen. He just never touched me in that way again. There was no discussion about it, Lyle said, but he believed it was always in the air between us. This is when they started talking about when the abuse stopped. I was worried a little bit I was going to be less loved, says Lyle, growing emotional, a blubber in his voice when discussing the end of the abuse, even saying he was unsure if he wanted it to stop. He was never harsh with me. I never got beaten for doing something wrong. So it was a devastating part of it in terms of just fear. I felt contaminated, but I felt love. So I worried a little bit about that. But I feel like my father loved me throughout my life. I wanted to believe my father loved me. So in my mind, I felt like he was a great man. And my main way of dealing with it was that it was just a sickness that some great men have, Lyle said. It happened when I was a little kid and it was over. Bearing the emotions was a big thing for me, he said. Lyle says his father was very brutal with physical abuse, choking, punching, closed fists, using a belt. There was no love in it. It was just surviving that moment. Lyle says his love for Erik was just a really infuriating thing for my father. Lyle says taking care of Erik gave him a purpose, helped to protect him from drowning in the spiral of his own life. Lyle says Erik was in trouble by the age of 3 and 4, crying all the time, stressed at that point, openly punished, spanked, viciously, thrown against things. My mother would drag him down the hall. I think I realized it was just the two of us. Lyle talked about his father making him train in tennis against older players, even adult men, in order to ramp up the difficulty. Garland asked Lyle if he felt competitive toward Erik in any way. Lyle says not in sports, but it felt like they were just competing for their parents' affections. Lyle told himself that his father started abusing Erik instead because he was easy. Jose wanted to move on from me. He wanted to be okay. Lyle says he tried to rationalize the switch and abuse targets and that maybe his father didn't want to derail Lyle's life with the physical abuse. Lyle says Jose started abusing Erik when Lyle was 13. Lyle's asked about when he abused Erik. So he was asked about when he abused Erik. I don't know why I did it. I think I was just trying to release it from me, he says. Lyle describes pain training sessions that were forced by his father where he hurt Erik in a non-sexual way but as a possible form of pain endurance. Garland begins asking Lyle about his relationship with his mother. Lyle says his mother also sexually abused him. Garland notes this is not included in the comprehensive risk assessment. And Lyle lets out a long sigh. I didn't see it as abuse, really. I just saw it as something special between my mother and I, so I don't like to talk about it that way. This is interesting, talking about the abuse from his mother. Today, I see it as sexual abuse. When I was 13, I felt like I was consenting and my mother was dealing with a lot, and I just felt like maybe it's abusive, but I never saw it that way, in the same way. Garland cites Lyle's comments in the risk assessment report where Lyle claims Kitty called him an accident and said she never wanted to give birth to him. Lyle says he may have left some details about his mother's sexual abuse out of interviews with doctors. He's clearly very uncomfortable when he was talking about this. They didn't ask. I didn't volunteer, he says. Garland begins to ask about Lyle's life at Princeton. Lyle discusses an instance where he was accused of plagiarism and suspended as a result. Garland then questioned Lyle about his license being suspended due to speeding violations, which Lyle said were largely the result of him not wanting to be late to practice for tennis, and this happened in New Jersey. Garland begins asking about the burglary allegations. Lyle confirmed Erik was behind the first burglary and showed off what he took from a safe. The second burglary, Lyle says Erik had it planned for 3 days after the first incident. Lyle says he should have obviously told him it's insane. Then Garland asked what his motive was, and Lyle said he didn't want his brother to go alone or Jose to find out because Lyle got caught. Said he had fear of Dad's reaction, which I think would have spilled over on me for sure. Garland then raised an issue of Lyle being strapped for cash around the time of the second burglary, which Lyle flatly denied, said he had an open credit card and access to bank accounts. Garland asked about his parents' reaction to the burglaries. Lyle says Jose was called by the father at one of the homes that was burglarized. Jose's reaction was, "You're a moron," and more colorful language for getting caught, for feeling sorry for the people that got burglarized. As I told you your whole life, the weakness is dangerous and stupid, and now I have to fix it, Jose said. That's what Lyle told the parole board. Lyle says any statement about him having financial problems at the time of the burglary came from his uncle Brian, who was opposed to our release. Lyle says Brian's statements were inaccurate. I think the best source of what was happening with me financially would be my Aunt Terry, he said. My uncle Brian lived in another state and didn't know us well. Garland then moved on to the topic of disinheritance. Lyle mentioned the therapist, Dr. Ozell, was told by Jose that they, again, Lyle and Erik, were taken out of the will. Garland asked why Lyle didn't write about being disinherited in his submissions to the board. Lyle says the disinheritance was not a motive for the killings, but it did become a problem afterwards, as they feared they would have no money once their parents were dead. I believe there was a will that disinherited us somewhere. Garland asks if Lyle did go to great lengths to make sure a hard drive was erased with any will on it that diminished the brothers. Garland asks about his parents recording Erik's phone calls. Lyle says he discovered recording equipment in the house, and it turns out my mother was just listening to conversations that my brother had with me. Garland then asked if the murders were planned. Lyle says they bought the guns, which made it more likely, but he says he didn't buy the guns specifically to plan his parents' death. I thought it was de-escalating. It gave me some measure of safety. There was zero planning. There was no way to know if it was going to happen Sunday, says Lyle, who now refers to buying the guns as the biggest mistake, but repeats that he bought them strictly for protection, emotional protection, he said. Lyle says they did not discuss potentially killing their parents when they bought the guns. He said they discussed serious threats that Jose, if it ever got out, long guns are not very useful for protection, but it was better than nothing, Lyle said. The decision to buy the guns was Thursday night. It was somewhat impulsive, and that was it. There was no other discussion, Lyle said. Garland then asked whose idea was to get the guns. Lyle said that he does not remember. Lyle says they bought shotguns, not handguns, because there was no waiting period. Lyle references going to a shooting range, a discussion about what ammunition to use for protection. Lyle recalls a discussion about using buckshot or birdshot. And then Lyle knew there was a lot of guns in his family's home, specifically his dad's bedroom. We had just always had guns in our home. There were guns in the house. Lyle says he had access to some of those weapons, but didn't check if they were reachable the night of the murders. Garland then reopened the discussion of when or if the murders were planned. So Rummel notes that Ozell was reporting on something Erik Menendez said. Rummel says Ozell was completely discredited at trial. So now they went back to talking about the therapist and asked Garland to ask Lyle about the nature of his discussions with Ozell. We're now talking about Dr. Ozell recorded that a different person said to him. So Garland says she doesn't know what to have a discussion. Sorry, this part's a little confusing. I don't want to invite your client to testify at something that could be an issue in a later court proceeding. So they kind of went back and forth about this with Ozell, the therapist. And then Rummel again says her objection is to pitting Lyle's insight against one appellate decision from a second trial without real consideration of who testified, what they testified to, and issues regarding the exclusion of sexual abuse evidence from the second trial. Garland again says the trial evidence is not relevant to this hearing because they're not retrying the case. So they go back to they had this back and forth, and now they go back to questioning Lyle. I realized there were no guns, but at the time I had those beliefs. I no longer believe that they were going to kill us in that moment today. At the time, I had that honest belief. So now he doesn't believe that they were going to kill them, the parents. I realized the only thought in my head was it was happening now. I needed to get to the door first. Fear overwhelmed reason. I don't have a great explanation for why I felt such terror in those moments, Lyle says. Garland asked Lyle about his feelings and emotions post-murder. I dropped my gun and walked out. I think shock, numb at that point, still panicked for a while. At some point, I realized I should be expecting the police, kind of just collapsing into this feeling of the same emotion that put me in the room that I was still in. Garland asked if there was any kind of relief, happiness, satisfaction. Lyle said no. Garland asked if he had ever had feelings of relief. I had feelings of regret, shock, Lyle says. Lyle said there was a total sort of crumbling of my life and even some resentment towards Erik in the weeks after the killings. I felt the shameful period of those 6 months of having to lie to relatives who were grieving just very much affected me. I felt the need to suffer. It was no relief. I sort of started to feel like I had not rescued my brother. I destroyed his life. I had rescued nobody. Garland questioning if Lyle's actions post-murder are consistent with the emotions he described. I think they're not consistent with it. I think they're both true. I didn't want to reveal to my Aunt Terry and to my family why this had happened and who my parents were behind closed doors. I also didn't want to go to prison, which I kind of equated with being separated from my brother. Rummel asked Garland to be specific about what she means by actions. Garland points out the spending spree Lyle and Erik went on post-murders, buying cars, fancy clothes, a restaurant, etc. Garland asks if spending, having flashy things helped him cope with the sorrow. Lyle says it helped him feel good in the moment, lifted him out of his anguish, but my life had just collapsed without my parents. Garland asks how much money Lyle thinks he spent. He begins describing purchases but doesn't give a dollar amount. And then Rummel redirects him to this point, and Lyle says when you include a $60,000 vehicle, maybe $100,000 was spent. Lyle says the restaurant was a business purchase for his uncle. And so then Garland asks why Lyle bought a Porsche. There's a pause in the hearing here. There's an issue with the call. My mother, because I love, Garland asked if one death gave Lyle more sorrow than the other. So I guess he didn't answer about the Porsche. My mother, because I loved her and I couldn't imagine harming her in any way. And I think also I learned a lot after about her life, her childhood, reflecting on how much fear maybe she felt. He said, I learned from her psychology, her therapist, that she felt shame. I had a deep connection with my father. He was the one who sort of guided my life. He had his plan. I was in his plan. I just felt lost without him. I had the opposite of relief. I had zero relief, Lyle says. Garland asks about how Lyle described the crime as impulsive with the sophistication of the web of lies and manipulation you just demonstrated afterwards. She says she's referring to scripts given to witnesses, the attempts to destroy a compelling will, escape plans from jail. Lyle again says there was no plan. It was a lot of flailing in what was happening, but I had more time to think about it sitting in a county jail alone in a cell one day. Garland again focused on Lyle coming up with sophisticated stories to have people lie for him. I hoped that they would help, so to some degree I trusted them. Garland asked if Lyle thinks he's a good liar. He says no, not now or then. Now, even though you fooled your entire family about you being the murderer and you recruited all these people to help you, you don't think that's being a good liar? They asked, and Lyle said the remorse he demonstrated gave people a strong belief that he didn't have anything to do with it. Garland said she's done with her questions about the crime itself, so now Commissioner Patrick Reardon takes over questioning on post-conviction factors, meaning his prison behavior. Lyle confirms he came to Donovan, the prison where he's currently housed in San Diego, in 2018, says he wants to focus on that time period until now. Reardon asks if Lyle, if October 24, 2024 is the closest he came to believing that he could be freed, and Lyle says yes. This is the date, by the way, that LA District Attorney George Gascon submitted the petition to resentence the Menendez brothers. Reardon says in reviewing Lyle's file, it felt like he was reading about two different incarcerated people. You seem to be different things at different times, he said. I don't think what I see is that you used a cell phone from time to time. There seems to be a mechanism in place that you always had a cell phone. Reardon says Lyle had access to a phone nearly all the time from 2018 to 2024, and Lyle didn't deny this. Reardon points out that Lyle had a good work history and an excellent educational history, as Lyle is currently working on his master's. Reardon asks if the board should give serious weight to Lyle taking part in self-help programming if he was using a cell phone. Reardon highlights and lauds Lyle for the Green Space program and other mentorship work, noting at the time that it was when there was no guarantee Lyle would ever get out of prison. Lyle tries to rationalize the cell phone use. He said that he was using the device to stay in touch with his family, his community. I felt like it served that, he said. Lyle didn't see it as him spending the criminal and non-criminal parts of his life. He didn't think he was harming anyone. You're a bright guy. You have a college degree. I'd think you would understand that use of cell phone taints the good things Lyle is doing in prison. That's what Reardon said. Lyle says he sometimes gets so focused on service work that he overlooks the means. Reardon questioned if this type of behavior could get him in trouble outside of prison. I had convinced myself that this wasn't a means that was harming anyone but myself in a rule violation. I didn't think it really disrupted prison management very much. So Reardon acknowledges Lyle pled guilty to 2 cell phone violations. This was November 2024 and then March 2025. There's 3 cell phone allegations under which Lyle was found not guilty. Reardon notes it's the same one of Lyle's cellmates who accepted responsibility in all those cases and then kind of questioned how it happened. All these cell phone incidents were at a time when Lyle lived in a dorm with 6 people, including himself. Often someone would take responsibility for the phone who didn't have anything to lose. Lyle acknowledged conspiring to use the phones was gang-like activity. Lyle says he and his cellmates probably went through at least 5 cell phones, and Reardon asks if Lyle remembers what personality disorder he was diagnosed with, which Lyle says had to do with having antisocial narcissistic traits. Lyle again repeats he sometimes justifies rule breaking if it furthers a positive goal. I would never call myself a model incarcerated person. I would say that I'm a good person, that I spent time helping people, that I'm very open and accepting, says Lyle, adding that he does a lot of good work with the vulnerable and picked on populations in prison. I'm the guy that officers will come to resolve conflicts, he said, calling himself a peacekeeper. At the time, I didn't feel that using the phone was inconsistent with that. Lyle says the first time he was caught with the phone, he allowed the DCR investigators to unlock it to prove that he wasn't involved in criminal activity, and Lyle internalized that as it being less of a problem, that he wasn't using it for criminal activity. Reardon asks how Lyle knows none of his cellmates are using a phone for criminal activity if they share a phone, and Lyle says that's a good point, and he doesn't know. Reardon raises how cell phones can be used to order hits, move drugs in prison, coordinate attacks on officers. Lyle acknowledges that he became more cognizant of the problems and things that the phone can cause as things went on. So then Reardon noted it's positive that Lyle immediately took steps to address his issues with cell phones, including establishing a support network. And Reardon asked why Lyle needed the illegal cell phones to make calls to family if he had a tablet for legitimate call use. And Rummel challenges that this needs to be discussed confidentially. So then Rummel says this will involve the public notoriety of his case and conduct by CDCR staff as to what thinking was going on why the tablet was insufficient. Reardon asks again about Lyle using the cell phones when he had a tablet. Lyle again references privacy. He says many of his communications were being sold to tabloids. Rummel says staff who were monitoring Lyle's communications on the tablet were selling details of Lyle's communications with his wife and family to tabloids. And then Lyle confirms this. I felt the phone was a way to protect my privacy. And then Reardon asks why Lyle didn't just send written communications to Lyle. Lyle agrees this would have been better. Rummel points out that CDCR staff monitors snail mail as well. Then Garland resumed questioning about, then they want to talk more about the cell phones. She asked if he was trying to hide or turn off the cell phones when officers approached him. Lyle says he was on a video chat and the officer was there. I did take the steps to disconnect from the video chat. I might have even said goodbye. Garland says the record is more deceitful than Lyle's description in the hearing. He again says he disconnected the call. I did turn it off and I handed it to him. Lyle says Donovan was the first place he got access to a cell phone in the prison system, said that there was a lot of stress in his marriage at the time he began using phones in Donovan, and he thought the phones, more conversation would help with that. Garland notes as a result of the March 2024 phone violations, Lyle lost his family visits as a result of the cell phone use. Lyle calls that a wake-up call, but Garland notes he did it again and cuts him off. He is now barred from family visits for 3 years. Garland asked Lyle about manipulating people inside his men's advisory council position. Lyle said this gave him access to wall phones more often and he was attacked over it. Lyle says this sometimes led to bartering in favors. This was because Lyle had controlled or some control of the phone list as to who would get to make calls and how long, and Lyle says he manipulated this to his benefit. Garland then asked for more examples of using the position to manipulate other inmates or leverage to his advantage. Lyle talks about getting to know CDCR staff as human beings over time and became more cognizant of how cell phones use in prison impacts them too. So he says he learned more about that. Garland says if Lyle thinks he's treated differently due to his celebrity status or his position on men's advisory council, and Lyle says in some ways he thinks he was scrutinized and searched more. Garland notes the risk assessment found Lyle would face a moderate risk of violence if released. She asks Lyle's thoughts. Garland reads from the risk assessments that the doctor found antisocial traits, entitlement, deception, manipulation, and not accepting consequences. Lyle said he's talked through these things with his doctor. Those elements were there with the cell phone use and he recognizes them now. Lyle said he used deception to survive his childhood, says his family home life was governed by the concept of lie, cheat, steal, but win. He doesn't agree with the idea that he has narcissistic traits. They're not the type of people like me, self-referring to mental health, who go to the doctor and say they can help me understand my personality better. He says Jose was a narcissist with zero self-reflection and zero concern for morality, and I just felt like that wasn't me. Garland asks about Lyle writing about benefits of being housed separate from Erik, even though they also campaigned to be together. Lyle talks about the positive of being separated. It helped him figure out himself, to learn his identity other than Big Brother, but also says they wanted to be able to be together given the strain on the family to not visit them both at the same time and because they shared trauma and a bond throughout incarceration. Garland says about status of Lyle's marriage. He says they've been having problems for 10 years in part due to the weight of them both coming from an abusive background. Garland reads the risk assessment, however, that Lyle and his wife thought about or heavily considered changing their marital status due to his possible release. Lyle says their status changed quite a few years before resentencing. Lyle is currently romantically corresponding with 3 different women, according to Garland, but Lyle says he's closest with his wife, his biggest supporter. That's interesting. 3 different women. Garland says Lyle has had hours of visits with a woman in the UK, increased since Lyle's visits from his wife slowed. Lyle says this was previously romantic, but it's since ended. Garland notes Dr. Hart found Lyle a very low risk of violence upon release as compared to risk assessment, finding that he was a moderate risk. And then they started asking some clarifying questions, asked if Lyle thinks it's important to tell the truth or have the truth be told in judicial or disciplinary or other hearings, and Lyle concurs that it is. They talked about his suspension from Princeton, that it was concerning plagiarism, which Lyle confirmed. Confirmed he conspired to get 3 witnesses to lie at trial, and he said yes. Asked about Tracy Baker lying on the stand about his mother's attempts to poison the family. Lyle says that he asked Tracy to lie, that she was there, but does not address whether his mother actually attempted to poison the family at dinner. Asked about his reaction to being disinherited. Lyle said it didn't have any effect on me. She asked about father's silence was concerning after Erik reported the abuse. Remembers Jose saying, "What does it matter anymore?" when Lyle asked about tennis camp. Lyle remembers Kitty shouting no one ever helped her when they confronted her about failing to stop Jose's abuse of Erik. Lyle's face turns red. He doubled over briefly, sniffling. The tears were visible now. I couldn't wrap my mind around the fact that she knew about the abuse, Lyle said, still struggling to speak. Rummel asked why Lyle struggles to discuss his mother's sexual abuse of him. And there's so little love in my relationship with my mother that was overt. We'd sometimes have these moments of connection. I get that it's abuse, but there was a lot of love in it. I know when I talk about it, someone else is going to use it as an abusive event, and I don't like it. He says he didn't want it to come out at trial. Lyle long believed none of his relatives knew the dark side of what was happening in this family, and he felt obliged to help keep Jose's secrets. Rummel asks if Lyle's sense of entitlement is born out of Jose's habit of being a fixer in Jose's life. Lyle seems to concur, but mostly just repeats Rummel's language, "I hid behind my dad." Rummel guides Lyle to push back on the narcissism diagnosis. Said, "My life has been defined by extreme violence. I want her to be defined by something else," he said in tears. Nonviolence was a promise he made to his grandmother, and says this has played a big part of his behavior inside prison. Rummel asks how the resentencing petition filing flipped a switch. Rummel asks how the resentencing petition filing flipped a switch or changed things for Lyle. It took a few months. It took my brother and I really wrapping our mind around it because you've sort of lived this moment for too long. Eventually, I wrapped my mind around it, is what he said. All right, so then they got to closing arguments, and Milius questions if Lyle has genuinely taken accountability for his conduct. He cites Lyle's inability to follow basic rules while in a highly structured setting, tallies 8 violations for which he's found guilty, says there was a willingness to commit crimes and violate prison rules. It shows a lack of growth, says the recency of cell phone violations is concerning, a pattern of conduct that culminated in 2024. Says based on his own personal analysis, the rules don't apply to him. There's no growth. It just appears that Lyle appears to be lying. When you look at him, Lyle has a documented history of lies made to avoid the consequence of his own actions. This is exactly consistent with his current behavior. When he commits a violation, he lies about it and he tries to avoid responsibility. Today, Lyle continues to lie about the central issues in his parents' murders. Milius raises how the brothers bought the guns, and that it was out of town distanced themselves from the pre-planned killings. And then there was the Rummel closing. We're 36 years and a couple of days from the date of this crime, more than a lifetime. Lyle Menendez spent the first 21 years of life in prison, in the prison of his home, and that the rest of life in his prison. Sorry, it's kind of weird, the grammar. Basically saying that he was in prison when he was out of jail, and he's been in prison now because of what he went through. Says the DA site clings to their 1990s. Sorry, I'm getting tired. Says the DA clings to their 1990s theory of the case and ignores the role the abuse played in the shootings. I hope that we're in a place today that we have a deeper understanding of childhood sexual abuse. Expressed frustration that the hearing has spent almost no time focused on Lyle's building positive relationships with CDCR staff. Questioned how finance could have been a motive for the brothers if they knew they were out of the will for a year before the killings. And then said every psychologist who has examined or discussed abuse with Mr. Menendez believes the abuse and believes that this crime was driven by trauma, and all of them believe that he does not pose a reasonable risk. This family knows Lyle Menendez. They've known him as a child. They say what was happening in that house. No one excuses what he did, but they all understand it. And then Lyle Menendez gave his closing statement, which I'll read to you. And he was crying at this point. Referenced August 20th is the anniversary of his crime. It's the anniversary of a crushing day for so many in my family. I think about all the phone calls of that day with the shattering news and the loss and grief. Despite all of this, they are still here showing up for me, disrupting their lives, dealing with public scrutiny, and I will never deserve it. Says he takes responsibility for all the pain. My mom and dad did not have to die that day. Says his decision to use violence that day was solely his. It's not his baby brother's responsibility. I'm profoundly sorry for who I was, for the harm that everyone has endured. Talks about his grandmother teaching him to make pinky promises, and they made one in the county jail. It's a moment he's thought about 1,000 times. He said, I will never be able to make up for the harm and grief I caused everyone in my family. I am so sorry to everyone, and I will forever be sorry. That was his final statement at the parole hearing. All right, so that's the latest here from California when it comes to Erik and Lyle Menendez's parole hearings. We'll have to see what happens in several years. Is it possible they could still get parole down the line? It's possible. I'm going to head back home this weekend, fly back to the East Coast, working on some new episodes for next week that I think you guys will find really interesting. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. Please click to subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later.